The receipt was already halfway across the counter before the diner could decide whether to breathe or stare, right there beneath a drooping Happy New Year banner and a strand of lights that blinked like tired eyes. Marisol Reyes felt the paper glide toward her, as if it carried weight far heavier than ink, and the chrome surface reflected it twice, like the moment needed witnesses. The air smelled of coffee, fried potatoes, and the last hour of a long year, sweetened by cheap champagne at a back booth where someone was practicing laughter. For a heartbeat, the whole room tightened into stillness, the kind that arrives when people sense money about to speak louder than character. And the man in the charcoal suit watched her the way certain men watch doors, expecting them to open. He didn't introduce himself the way ordinary customers did, with a name and a smile that asked for warmth in return. He sat as if the booth had been reserved for him by the simple fact of his arrival, cuffs crisp, hair silvered and combed back with careful control. In the soft glow of the diner's holiday garlands, his expression held a thin, practiced politeness that never quite reached his eyes. Marisol noticed small details the way exhausted workers always do. His spotless shoes, the watch that looked like a private vault, the faint impatience in the tap of his finger. Behind him, the manager hovered near the pass-through window, already calculating what kind of trouble or miracle might be happening at his counter. The man's gaze didn't wander, not even toward the countdown chalkboard on the wall. It stayed fixed on her, steady and measuring. The words on the receipt were plain enough to be cruel. Tip, $10,000. A soft sound ran through the room, someone's inhale, someone's chair shifting, someone swallowing down envy or hope. Marisol's throat tightened because her mind instantly did what it always did, lining up rent, electric, groceries, the quiet emergencies that never asked permission. Her hands were sore from a double shift, and her apron pocket held a phone that had been buzzing with warnings from the world outside. For a second, the money looked like relief, bright and clean on paper, as if it could wash away months of worry with a single stroke of ink. But relief that arrives with an audience can feel less like help and more like a leash. Marisol did not reach for it. She placed 2 fingers on the receipt, not trembling now, and slid it back toward him with the gentleness of someone returning a belonging that had been misplaced. The manager's face tightened, and a couple in the corner went suddenly quiet, as if they feared her refusal might offend the universe. The billionaire's mouth curved, waiting for her to soften, waiting for gratitude to rise the way it usually did when he pushed. Instead, she lifted her eyes and held his gaze with something he wasn't used to being given: plain honesty, offered without fear and without performance. "I can't be your proof," she said softly, "and I won't let you rent my dignity for one night." It was such a simple sentence that it didn't sound like a speech at all, and that was what made it land like a stone dropped into deep water. His smile faltered, not in anger but in a sudden private confusion, as if her words had brushed against a bruise he kept hidden under tailored fabric. The lights above them flickered, and somewhere a glass clinked, and the world kept preparing to welcome a new year that didn't care about anyone's pride. For the first time since he walked in, the man's eyes looked less like polished metal and more like something human, something tired. And in the silence that followed, he seemed to realize he hadn't come to give anything at all, only to see what it would cost her to take it. For a moment, the diner didn't feel like a place at all, but like a paused scene where everyone had forgotten their lines. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter grew louder, a steady mechanical breath that filled the gaps where conversation should have been. Somewhere near the window, a family's paper party hat sat untouched beside a plate of cooling fries, and the string lights above the booths blinked patiently, indifferent to pride. Marisol kept her hands folded on the counter edge, fingers laced as if she were holding herself together from the inside. She could feel the weight of her refusal settling into the room, heavy, unfamiliar, and strangely clean. The billionaire didn't move right away. His eyes remained on the receipt, then lifted to her face again, as though searching for the trick, the hidden motive, the angle he could recognize and label. Men like him were trained by boardrooms and quiet victories to believe every no eventually became a yes if the number grew large enough. But Marisol's refusal had not been dramatic, not loud, not crafted for applause. It had been almost tender, like a boundary placed gently between two strangers. His jaw flexed once, a small tell that the polished mask had shifted. In the background, Dean, the manager, hovered closer, caught between fear of losing money and fear of losing control, his hands rubbing together as if trying to warm a decision. Marisol felt her heart hammering, not with triumph, but with the familiar panic of someone who has just chosen the harder road on purpose. Her mind flashed to the envelope on her kitchen table, the one stamped in red that made her stomach knot every time she pictured it. $10,000 was not just generosity, it was electricity kept on, it was rent paid, it was her brother's school supplies, it was a month where she could breathe without bargaining with the future. She let herself feel all of that fully, because pretending she didn't need it would have been another kind of lie. Then she let the need pass through her, the way her mother had taught her to let storms pass, by standing still and refusing to be carried away. "Miss?" Dean began, voice tight, as if he were trying to keep the word respectful while dragging it toward obedience. He glanced at the receipt, then at the man's suit, then back at Marisol, silently pleading for the version of reality where money solved everything and nobody asked questions. The billionaire's expression shifted again, and for a second Marisol saw something behind it, not kindness exactly, but weariness. An old disappointment that had been carefully dressed up as certainty. He leaned forward slightly, elbows near the edge of the table, and spoke with the calm confidence of someone used to being listened to. "People say that," he murmured, "until they understand what they're turning down." Marisol's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. The lights above them threw soft shadows across his face, carving out the lines near his eyes that looked less like age and more like sleepless years. She could almost hear the question he wasn't asking, the one he had hidden inside this test like a needle inside a gift. Did goodness still exist when nobody was watching? Could a person refuse power and still survive? Marisol breathed in slowly, tasting coffee and winter air leaking through the door, and she realized the truth was simpler than his games. Survival mattered, but so did the soul you survived with. And as the countdown chalkboard ticked closer to midnight, she felt the room waiting for his next move, as if one man's pride might decide how the new year would begin. Marisol stepped out into the cold between orders, letting the winter air bite her cheeks, just enough to keep her awake. The parking lot was speckled with leftover snow that had turned grey at the edges, and the distant fireworks sounded like a celebration happening in a different world. She pulled her jacket tighter, feeling the day's grease and coffee clinging to her hair, and checked her phone with the dread of someone who already knew what she'd see. 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails, and a single red-marked reminder that refused to soften with time. Even before she listened, her body understood it the way a bruise recognizes pressure. Her apartment sat above a shuttered laundromat, the hallway smelling of detergent and old heat, the stairs creaking like they remembered too many heavy months. Inside, the living room was also a bedroom, also a study, also a waiting room for tomorrow's problems. Her little brother Nico slept on the couch with a textbook open on his chest, a pencil still in his hand, as if he'd tried to outwork fear and lost. A small lamp glowed beside him, throwing warm light over the chipped mug that held their spare change, like a joke that had stopped being funny. Marisol stood there quietly, not moving, because even love can feel fragile when the world is loud and hungry. On the kitchen table sat the envelope she'd been pretending wasn't there, placed so neatly it looked like an insult. The paper was thick, official, and stamped with a red urgency that made her stomach tighten the way it had at the diner when she saw the number on the receipt. She didn't open it at first. She washed her hands, took off her shoes, and set her keys down with care, as if gentleness could keep the ceiling from falling in. Her mother's voice rose in her memory, calm and stubborn, saying that pride wasn't the enemy. Desperation was, because desperation taught people to trade pieces of themselves for breath. Marisol had nodded at those words years ago, without fully understanding that one day she would be standing in a dim kitchen, deciding what exactly she could afford to lose. She finally tore the envelope open, slow enough to feel every second like a choice. The notice inside was brief, polite, and merciless. Past due balance, final warning, termination of service scheduled unless payment was received by a date that was uncomfortably close. Her eyes blurred for a moment, and she pressed her thumb to the paper, as if she could smudge the truth away. $10,000 flashed in her mind like a cruel lighthouse, so close, so bright, and built on rocks she refused to crash into. In the next room, Nico turned in his sleep and muttered her name, and the sound of it broke her into smaller pieces she had to gather quickly. Marisol folded the notice and slid it under a stack of unopened mail, not hiding it from reality, only postponing the moment it would own her. She sat at the edge of a chair and stared at the wall where a small framed photo hung, her mother smiling in a church dress, the kind of smile that had survived things it never bragged about. In that stillness, she realized the billionaire's test had followed her home, not as temptation, but as a mirror held up to everything she was trying to protect. Her hands trembled, not with regret, but with the fear of what dignity might cost when the lights finally went out. And before the clock could reach midnight, her phone buzzed again with a new message that made her lungs forget how to breathe. The message on Marisol's screen was short, official, and sharp enough to cut through exhaustion. Her final paycheck would be delayed. Processing issue, it said. No date promised, no apology offered. She stared at it until the letters blurred, feeling the familiar squeeze of panic tighten around her ribs. It wasn't just bad timing. It was a reminder that the world always seemed to collect its debts right when a person ran out of strength. In the other room, Nico shifted in his sleep, and the small sound anchored her to what mattered most. Marisol set the phone down carefully, as if roughness might wake the whole house into fear. Back at the diner, time kept moving toward midnight with the stubbornness of a train that didn't care who was standing on the tracks. Dean, the manager, hovered behind the counter like a man watching his own future wobble on the edge of a coin, and the regular customers pretended to study menus they already knew by heart. The billionaire remained seated, still, almost patient, but the stillness had a demanding shape to it, like a hand held out, waiting to be filled. The receipt sat between him and Marisol as if it were a contract, not a tip, and the ink looked darker under the blinking lights. He tapped it once, not impatiently, but deliberately, as if he believed every human decision could be nudged into compliance. "You're making a mistake," he said, the words smooth enough to sound like concern. He spoke quietly, but the room leaned toward him anyway, because wealth has a gravity that pulls attention without permission. Marisol didn't argue, because she knew how arguments fed men like this, how they turned pride into a game and called it negotiation. She simply shook her head, slow, respectful, final. "It would be a mistake," she answered, "if I let you decide what I'm worth." Something in his eyes tightened, not anger exactly, but discomfort, like a man realizing the floor beneath him isn't as solid as he assumed. He studied her face again, and in that study was a strange hunger, as if he was searching for the crack where desperation would show itself and prove him right. "People always talk about dignity," he murmured, until they're faced with reality. The word reality landed heavy, as if he owned it, as if hardship were a lecture he delivered to others from a safe distance. Marisol felt her pulse thud in her wrists, and still she kept her voice steady, because steadiness was sometimes the only wealth she had. "The reality," she said, "is I do need help." The honesty caused a soft stir in the room. Someone shifting, someone inhaling, someone surprised she didn't pretend to be stronger than she felt. "But help that comes with strings isn't help," she continued, her gaze never leaving his. "It's a trade, and I'm not trading myself for relief." Dean's face twisted, half frustration, half fear, because he could already imagine the billionaire standing up, leaving, and taking a story, and a donation, with him. The billionaire leaned back, and for a moment the suit looked less like armor and more like a costume a tired man couldn't take off. Then he smiled, thin and controlled, and reached into his wallet as if he were about to raise the stakes. "All right," he said softly, like a man setting a trap with velvet gloves. "No public thank you, no speech, no cameras." He slid a second piece of paper forward, an address, a name, an appointment time. "Just meet me tomorrow," he added, voice gentle enough to be dangerous. 15 minutes. I'll make sure you never worry again." And as the clock above the coffee machine clicked toward midnight, Marisol felt the room turn colder, because the offer sounded like mercy, and yet it carried the faint, unmistakable scent of a condition he hadn't said out loud. Marisol stared at the slip of paper as if it were a doorway drawn in ink, a neat address and a time that tried to sound ordinary. The promise underneath it, "I'll make sure you never worry again," hung in the air like perfume meant to cover something sharper. Around them, the diner kept pretending it was still a diner. Plates clinked, a fork scraped, the cook called out an order with forced normalcy, yet the space between Marisol and the billionaire felt suddenly private, sealed off by the kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice. She could feel Dean watching her from the corner of his eye, praying she would take the offer so the night could end without conflict. The billionaire's expression remained calm, almost patient, as though he were giving her the courtesy of a choice while already knowing the outcome. He had softened the edges of the test, wrapped it in a polite invitation, but Marisol could still hear the same question underneath. How much would it take? His eyes flicked to her hands, hands with small burns from coffee, hands that had wiped tables and carried trays, and opened bills she couldn't pay. For a moment she hated how visible her life must look to him, like numbers in a file. And she hated more that a small part of her wanted to believe him, because exhaustion can make even a cage look like shelter. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, as if he could read the suspicion on her face and wanted to erase it with a smoother sentence. He leaned forward just enough to make the offer feel intimate, reasonable, safe. 15 minutes, he repeated, voice low. "You can walk away after, but you won't." The confidence in that last line wasn't arrogance. It was certainty, the kind that comes from a lifetime of people eventually folding. Behind Marisol, Dean shifted and cleared his throat, ready to jump in with encouragement, ready to sell her compliance as practicality. Marisol picked up the paper with 2 fingers, not as acceptance, but as inspection. The address wasn't a diner address, not a charity office, not anything that spoke of simple help. It carried the weight of a downtown building with glass walls and silent floors. She imagined elevators, security desks, the feeling of being too small inside a room, designed for men who never ask permission. She imagined signing something she didn't understand, owing something she couldn't repay, smiling because someone told her gratitude was the cost of survival. Her stomach tightened, and she heard her mother again, not as a lecture but as a quiet warning. Some gifts don't want to lift you, they want to own the story of lifting you. Marisol set the paper down, gently, the way you put down a knife you don't intend to use. "I believe you," she said, and the billionaire's eyes warmed a fraction, as if victory had finally arrived. Then she added, "I believe you think you're not asking for anything." The warmth disappeared, replaced by that thin, careful look of a man whose control has been brushed against. Marisol's voice stayed soft, but it carried the weight of something unmovable. "But you are," she continued. "You're asking me to step into your world so you can feel like the hero in mine." The room seemed to hold its breath again, and even the blinking lights above the counter looked slower, as if time itself was listening. The billionaire's jaw tightened, not in rage, but in a sudden private hurt, because her words had landed somewhere deeper than pride. For one brief second, his eyes looked like the eyes of a man who had been disappointed too many times and learned to call disappointment truth. He glanced away, and when he looked back, there was something unsettled in him, something old stirring under the suit. And Marisol realized with a quiet chill that this was only the first wound, because the more she refused to play his game, the more he would feel compelled to prove that his rules still worked. The billionaire's gaze returned to the receipt, as if he could rewrite the moment by staring hard enough, and then he did what men like him always did when they felt a boundary. He raised the value of the offer in his mind, even if the number on the paper stayed the same. Around them, the diner tried to thaw back into noise, but the sound came in thin layers, cautious and incomplete, like music after a bad argument. Dean shifted behind the counter with the restless energy of someone who wanted resolution more than truth. A couple near the window exchanged a glance that carried both envy and fear, because they knew what $10,000 could do to a life, and they also knew what it could ask in return. Outside, the fireworks kept cracking open the sky, bright and brief, as if celebration itself had learned not to linger. "You're proud," the man said at last, not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. He spoke softly, the way you speak when you believe your tone is a gift. "That's admirable," he added, tilting his head as if he were granting her permission to be herself, "but it won't keep the lights on." His voice carried that practiced certainty, half logic, half threat, like a winter wind that insisted it was only weather. Marisol felt her chest tighten, because he had named the very thing she was trying not to show, that her strength had limits, that her bravery had a price, that she was tired of being strong. She could have defended herself, could have spoken sharply, but sharpness would have turned her into the character he expected. Instead, she let his words hang there and chose a calmer truth. "I'm not proud," she said, and her voice didn't tremble this time. "I'm careful." The difference between the two was something her mother had taught her without ever calling it wisdom. Pride shouts, but caution whispers, because it has survived. Marisol's eyes flicked toward Dean, who was now watching her like she was threatening his entire business with one refusal. Then she looked back at the billionaire, at the clean lines of his suit and the tiredness hidden beneath them, and she understood how badly he needed her to accept, not because he cared about her rent, but because he needed the world to behave the way his money told it to. If she could be bought, then everything stayed simple. If she couldn't, then something in him had to face a question he'd avoided for years. Dean cleared his throat, stepping closer with a smile that didn't match his eyes. "Marisol," he murmured, loud enough for her to hear and quiet enough to pretend it wasn't pressure. "It's New Year's. Don't make this difficult. Just take it." The words "just take it" carried the same tone she had heard in other places, at offices, at counters, at doors where people with less power were expected to be grateful for whatever was offered, no matter the cost. Marisol felt the old shame rise, quick and hot, the shame of needing help and being judged for it. She took a slow breath and refused to let it steer her. "If you want to help," she said, still facing the billionaire, "then help without turning me into a story you can own." For a second, his eyes narrowed, and the politeness in his expression tightened into something colder. "Without strings," he repeated, as if tasting the phrase and finding it unrealistic. His fingers tapped the table once, twice, measured, controlled, like a metronome keeping time for a decision. Then his hand moved toward the receipt again, and Marisol felt the room lean forward, waiting for the next move, in a game only he believed he was playing. "Fine," he said quietly, and a small smile returned, sharper this time. "No meeting tomorrow, no address, no condition you can point to." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "But I want one thing." Marisol's stomach tightened, because there it was, the truth stepping out from behind the velvet. Dean's eyes widened with relief, already assuming Marisol would say yes, already preparing to act like he had helped her reach the right decision. The billionaire leaned in slightly, as if sharing a secret, and his voice dropped into something almost gentle. "I want you," he said, "to thank me. Right here, in front of everyone, just a few words." His smile held a quiet satisfaction, because he knew how small the request sounded and how large it was in meaning. And as the countdown board clicked closer to midnight, Marisol realized the number on the receipt had never been the point at all. It had always been about control dressed up as kindness. The request sounded small, almost polite, the way a needle looks harmless until it's in your skin. "Just a few words," the billionaire said, and his smile held that quiet certainty men wear when they've never been refused without consequences. The diner's lights blinked overhead like tired applause, and the banner sagged a little more as if even it was ashamed. Marisol could feel every eye in the room turning toward her, hungry for a scene, hungry for a lesson, hungry for proof that money still ruled the ending. Dean stood close behind the counter now, his shoulders tense, his mouth already shaped around a speech about being grateful. "Lie." The countdown chalkboard on the wall read 12:07 to midnight, and suddenly time felt like a trap with a closing door. Marisol's throat tightened, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew exactly what those words would cost. If she thanked him publicly, she would be swallowing her own boundary in front of strangers, turning her dignity into a performance for a man who needed to feel adored. She pictured Nico on the couch with his textbook, the red stamped notice on her table, the phone message about her paycheck being delayed, all of it pressing on her like hands. She understood the temptation in a way that made her cheeks burn. $10,000 could buy oxygen for a family that had been breathing through a straw. But she also understood something else, something quieter. If she handed him those words, she'd be teaching herself that fear gets to write her sentences. And once fear learns it can speak for you, it never stops. Dean leaned in, voice low, urgent. "Marisol," he hissed, eyes flicking toward the receipt like it was salvation. "Don't do this to yourself. Don't do this to me. Just say it." His tone carried the old message she had heard too many times. Your discomfort is less important than everyone else's convenience. The billionaire watched her as if he could already hear her surrender, as if gratitude was simply the final signature required. Marisol looked at the receipt, then at the man, and she felt a strange calm arrive, thin at first, then steady. She picked up the pen from the counter and held it between her fingers, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that she still had a choice. "I won't thank you," she said softly, and the words didn't shake. "Not like that. Not for this." The diner seemed to shrink around the sentence, the air drawing tight, the booths suddenly too close. Dean's face changed, the relief draining out of him and leaving something hard behind. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped, louder than he meant to, but the sound of anger had been waiting in him all night. He turned toward the billionaire with a strained smile, as if apologizing for a broken appliance. "Sir, I'm so sorry," he said quickly. She's having a moment." Marisol felt the humiliation try to rise again, familiar as an old bruise, but she didn't bow her head. She looked at Dean, really looked at him, and saw fear wearing anger like a coat. "No," she said, still calm. "I'm having a spine." The billionaire's eyes narrowed, not in rage, but in a cold curiosity, because now the test had slipped out of his control and become something else. Dean's lips pulled back and his voice turned sharp enough to slice. "Fine," he barked, pointing toward the back like a judge delivering a sentence. "Then take off your apron. You're done. You're fired." Yeed, the room made a small sound, a collective gasp that tried to pretend it wasn't taking sides. Marisol's hands moved to her apron strings, and for a moment the simple act of untying them felt like losing a piece of herself. She folded the apron carefully, because she refused to let the ending look messy, and she placed it on the counter as if laying down something sacred. The billionaire stared at her, and in his eyes there was a flash of surprise, genuine, almost startled, because he hadn't expected his own game to break someone else's life so quickly. Marisol didn't look at him again. She walked toward the door, the bell above it chiming once, bright and cruel, and the winter air rushed in like a verdict. Outside, the cold hit her lungs and made her vision blur, the streetlights haloed by thin mist and distant fireworks. She stepped onto the sidewalk with nothing in her pockets but a phone, a bus card, and the stubborn decision she'd made. Behind her, the diner door closed, and the laughter inside resumed in uneasy waves, as if the world could restart just because it wanted to. Marisol took one step, then another, toward a future that suddenly had no paycheck, no shelter from the overdue notice, no soft landing. And then, at the edge of the parking lot, a black car rolled to a stop beside her, its window lowering with a whisper, while a voice she recognized, calm and deliberate, spoke her name. The black car rolled up beside Marisol like a thought she didn't want to have, smooth and quiet, its headlights painting pale bars across the wet pavement. The window lowered with a soft sigh, and warm air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of leather and something expensive that never had to worry about the cold. "Marisol Reyes," the billionaire said calmly, as if her name had been placed into his hand, along with the receipt. She stopped walking, but she did not step closer, because life had taught her that comfort offered by power often comes wrapped in invisible rope. Behind her, the diner's neon kept blinking like a heartbeat that didn't care who had just been fired. Above them, fireworks cracked open the sky and died again, bright enough to make strangers believe in new beginnings for a few seconds at a time. "I didn't tell you my last name," Marisol said, and she hated that her voice sounded steady when her heart was beating like a warning. The billionaire didn't blink, didn't apologize, didn't soften. He simply watched her the way a man watches the result of an experiment he expects to repeat. "Your manager did," he replied, and the simplicity of it made her stomach tighten, because it meant he had already stepped into her world without asking. The street was slick with thin ice and scattered confetti, and somewhere down the block a group of people laughed too loudly, trying to drown out whatever loneliness followed them into the new year. Marisol hugged her arms around herself, not for drama, but because the cold had moved into her bones like a debt. She looked at the car door handle and imagined how easy it would be to surrender to warmth, to let the night become someone else's problem. The billionaire's hand appeared at the window holding a folded coat, dark and heavy, offered with the casualness of someone who had never had to decide between pride and survival. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, and the words almost sounded like care until she heard the ownership hidden beneath them. "You belong somewhere I can control." Marisol didn't take the coat, but she didn't pretend she wasn't shivering, because denial was not a virtue. It was just another way to lose. "I'll manage," she answered, and even as she said it, she pictured Nico asleep on the couch with his textbook open, The final notice on the kitchen table, the message about her paycheck being delayed. She thought of the electricity shutting off, the apartment going dark, her brother waking up afraid. The billionaire watched her face shift through all of that, as if he could see the math running behind her eyes. "Let me help you," he said, and there it was again, the same sentence as the receipt, the same shape of generosity that expected gratitude as proof of his own goodness. Marisol swallowed, tasting winter air and the bitterness of knowing how badly she needed help. "Help," she said quietly, "is when someone lifts you without making you small." The billionaire's jaw tightened, and for a moment his expression looked less like confidence and more like irritation at a rule he couldn't bend. She saw it then, the reason he had stayed, the reason he had followed her into the night. He wasn't chasing her acceptance. He was chasing relief from his own doubt, his own emptiness, his own fear that nothing in the world remained untouched by money. And Marisol understood that if she stepped into that car, she wouldn't just be taking warmth, she'd be stepping into the role he needed her to play. She turned away from the car and walked toward the bus stop, each step heavy with the kind of courage that doesn't feel heroic at all, only necessary. The bench was cold, metal cutting through her coat, and the streetlight above it flickered like an exhausted witness. Marisol sat with her hands clasped tight, breathing slowly, letting the night press against her until she could hear her own thoughts again. She whispered a prayer that wasn't polished, wasn't pretty, just a request for one more day of strength, one more chance to keep her family safe without selling the parts of herself her mother had fought to protect. The fireworks kept bursting overhead, strangers shouting the last seconds of the year, but Marisol felt like she was sitting outside of time, alone with a choice she had already made. And when her phone buzzed again in her pocket, she reached for it with numb fingers, fearing it would carry another blow, only to see a message that made her breath catch in a different, stranger way. The message on Marisol's phone wasn't from a bill collector or dean or anyone with authority to make her night worse. It was from Mrs. Delaney, the older woman who always sat by the window booth with a book she never finished, and a smile that never felt like pity. "I saw what happened. I'm nearby. Don't move." Marisol read it twice, not because the words were complicated, but because kindness without a price can feel unreal when you've gone too long without it. The bench beneath her was cold enough to sting through her clothes, and her fingers had gone stiff from winter air and fear. Above the street, fireworks kept splitting the sky, bright and loud, but the message in her hand felt quieter than all of it, and somehow stronger. A few minutes later, a modest sedan pulled up at the curb, headlights soft, the engine humming like a patient breath. Mrs. Delaney stepped out with careful movements, bundled in a thick coat and a knitted scarf, her grey hair tucked under a simple hat. She didn't rush at Marisol the way people do when they want to play rescuer. She approached slowly, giving space, giving dignity. "Honey," she said gently, as if the word had been waiting in her chest all evening, "I didn't like the way they looked at you." Marisol's throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't answer because the weight of being seen, truly seen, pressed harder than the cold. Mrs. Delaney held out a pair of gloves, not as charity, but as practicality, like handing someone a towel after rain. "I don't want to be a burden," Marisol managed, the sentence tasting like old shame. Mrs. Delaney didn't argue, didn't correct her, didn't lecture her about pride. She simply shook her head once, firm and kind. "You're not," she said. "You're a person who got pushed, and I'm a person who can stand beside you." The simplicity of it made Marisol's eyes sting, because it didn't try to make her story inspirational or dramatic. It just made her human. Mrs. Delaney opened the passenger door and waited, not pulling, not insisting, letting Marisol choose her own way into warmth. When Marisol finally slid into the seat, the heater air hit her face, and she had to bite down on a sob that wanted to embarrass her. Mrs. Delaney drove through streets littered with confetti and melting snow, past strangers shouting countdowns that were already over. Inside the car, the world felt smaller and safer, and Marisol realized how exhausted she had been from carrying fear like a second job. "Tell me what happened," Mrs. Delaney said, eyes on the road, voice soft enough that it didn't trap Marisol. So Marisol told her about the receipt, the $10,000, the request for public gratitude, the firing that came like a slap. She didn't leave out the part where she needed the money because honesty was the only thing she refused to bargain away. Mrs. Delaney listened without flinching, and when Marisol finished, the older woman nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew about the world. At Mrs. Delaney's small house, a single lamp glowed in the front window, and a little tree still stood in the corner, with a few lights blinking lazily, refusing to let the holidays end abruptly. The scent of soup and herbs filled the air, the kind of smell that makes the body unclench before the mind gives permission. Mrs. Delaney set a bowl in front of Marisol and said, "Eat," the way a mother says it when love has no time for ceremony. Marisol's hands trembled as she lifted the spoon, and the first warm mouthful made her realize how close she'd been to breaking. In that kitchen, with nothing expensive and everything sincere, her refusal at the diner suddenly felt less like foolishness and more like protection. Across town, in a mansion lit like a museum, the billionaire sat alone in a room too large for one man's silence. The party sounds had faded, the staff had gone quiet, and the new year had arrived without asking permission. He loosened his tie and stared at the same receipt he'd brought home, as if it were evidence in a case he couldn't win. Marisol's words replayed in his mind, "I can't be your proof," and the sentence struck him like a truth he'd spent decades outrunning. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, edges worn from being handled more than he would admit. And as he looked at the smiling face beside his younger self, he felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, something that wasn't control or pride or victory, but the first sharp pull of regret that demanded to be answered. The mansion welcomed the new year the way it welcomed everything else, quietly, expensively, and without joy. Its hallways were lit like galleries, every surface polished, every painting perfectly placed, yet the silence inside it felt heavier than any decor could hide. The billionaire walked through rooms that seemed designed to impress guests who never stayed long enough to notice the loneliness, his shoes making a soft sound on marble that reminded him of distance. Somewhere far away, a final firework popped and faded, and the darkness returned as if it had been waiting patiently for the lights to stop pretending. He loosened his tie and stood still, listening, realizing there was no applause in a life built on control. On his desk, the receipt lay like evidence, the ink shouting what his heart refused to admit. He had written that number as if it were a solution, as if a large tip could purchase a clean ending to a messy question. Yet the moment kept replaying with relentless clarity. Marisol pushing the paper back, her eyes steady, her voice quiet enough to be real. "I can't be your proof." The sentence wasn't clever, wasn't cruel, and that was precisely why it had pierced him. For years, he had paid for compliance, rewarded silence, punished resistance, and called it the natural order of things, until one exhausted waitress in a simple diner treated his money like it was not the center of the universe. He opened a drawer and took out an old photograph, the edges worn in a way his possessions rarely were. In the picture, he was younger, less guarded, less certain, and beside him stood a woman smiling as if the world still made sense. Her hand rested on his arm, not possessive, not performative, just present, and the warmth in her eyes made the room feel colder by comparison. He remembered a promise he had made once, back when his hunger hadn't yet become a habit, that he would build success without losing himself inside it. Time had turned that promise into a sentence he avoided, tucked away like the photo, only touched in rare moments when sleep wouldn't come. Tonight, sleep felt impossible because regret had finally found him and refused to leave. In another wing of the house, a clock ticked loudly, absurdly loud, as if time wanted to be heard. He thought of his children, polished, accomplished, surrounded by comfort, and felt a strange ache he had never allowed himself to name. He had given them everything except the one thing that couldn't be bought, a reason to care about people who couldn't offer anything back. He saw their faces at the thought of his money, too eager, too entitled, too certain, and for the first time he wondered if his empire had not protected them, but hollowed them. Marisol's refusal hadn't merely embarrassed him, it had held up a mirror, and in that mirror he saw a man who had spent decades trying to outbid loneliness. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he rarely used after midnight, then paused with his thumb hovering as if the call itself might change him. When he finally pressed it, the ring sounded too loud in the quiet room, and he watched the city lights beyond the window like they were a distant shoreline. "It's me," he said when his lawyer answered, voice rougher than he expected. "I need to see you first thing in the morning." There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that arrives when people sense money about to move in ways it never has before. And as he stared at the old photograph on his desk, he added almost to himself, "We're changing the will," while somewhere deep inside him, a long-buried fear whispered that his family would not forgive what he was about to do. Morning arrived without mercy, pale winter light spilling over glass and stone, as if the sun were only doing its job, not offering comfort. The dining room in the mansion looked like a magazine spread, linen too white to touch, silverware aligned with ruthless precision, a long table that could seat a dozen but often held only 3. His children were already there, dressed in elegance that resembled armor, scrolling through screens, sipping coffee as if time was something they owned. The billionaire entered quietly, and still the room shifted around him, because even grown children learn to feel power before they hear it. Outside, the world continued its new year, but inside the air carried the stale scent of old control. He didn't mention the diner at first. He watched them for a moment, his son adjusting cufflinks with distracted impatience, his daughter scanning messages with the bored confidence of someone whose safety was guaranteed. They spoke about investments, a charity gala, an article that praised the company's growth, and they did it all with the same tone people use when discussing weather, inevitable, impersonal, and certain. The billionaire felt a weight in his chest that wasn't sickness yet, but something close, a realization that he had raised heirs to an empire, not stewards of a legacy. When he finally said, "I met someone last night," the words landed on the table like a glass set down too hard. Their eyes lifted, curious only because it might affect them. "A waitress," he added, and he watched the reactions bloom exactly as he feared. Smirks, dismissive glances, a quick laugh that didn't even try to be polite. "On New Year's Eve," his son said, leaning back as if the idea itself was entertainment. "Dad, you went to a diner." His daughter's mouth tightened, not in concern but irritation, as if he had embarrassed the family brand by stepping into an ordinary place. The billionaire kept his voice calm, but inside him something hardened into clarity. "She refused $10,000, he said, letting the sentence hang, letting it reveal what it revealed. "She refused because I asked her to thank me in front of everyone." Silence followed, thin, sharp, then his son chuckled as if solving a simple problem. "So you found a stubborn one," he said. "What do you want, applause for her?" The billionaire looked at his children and saw, with painful precision, how little they understood what had actually happened. They weren't curious about her character, her life, her courage, or the quiet dignity that had stopped him cold. They were curious about the spectacle, the leverage, the outcome. "That's not the point," he said, and the words sounded heavier than he intended because the point had been missing in this house for years. His daughter rolled her eyes slightly, then masked it with a sip of coffee. "Dad," she said, voice smooth and practical, "people do things for attention, or they're negotiating. If she refused, she wants more." The billionaire felt something inside him crack, not rage but grief, because the cynicism in her sentence sounded exactly like the worldview he had taught them without ever speaking it aloud. At the same time, across town, Marisol sat at Mrs. Delaney's small kitchen table with a bowl of soup cooling in front of her and her phone vibrating like a trapped insect. The diner's payroll message had been replaced by something worse. "Final paycheck withheld pending review. Policy violation. Contact management." Marisol stared at it, and the room seemed to tilt, because even the little safety she expected at the end of the week was being pulled away. She thought of the final notice under her stack of mail, of Nico's school, of the lights that might go out, and her hands began to shake in a way she couldn't hide. Mrs. Delaney reached over and covered her fingers with her own, warm and steady, saying nothing, because sometimes comfort is just presence. Back in the mansion, the billionaire's lawyer arrived, briefcase in hand, expression carefully neutral in the face of family tension. The billionaire didn't waste time. "We're changing the will," he said, and the room reacted as if he'd thrown a match onto a dry floor. His son sat forward sharply, his daughter's eyes narrowed, and the polite morning atmosphere cracked open into something raw. "Because of a waitress?" his son demanded, disbelief turning instantly into anger. "You can't be serious." The billionaire's lawyer shifted, already anticipating lawsuits, headlines, and bloodless warfare disguised as procedure. "This could be complicated," the lawyer warned quietly, but the billionaire's gaze stayed fixed, steady, almost peaceful, as if he had finally chosen something that mattered more than being liked. He reached for the pen anyway. His hand moved across the document with deliberate strokes, each signature a quiet rebellion against the man he had been yesterday. The moment should have felt triumphant, but instead it felt like stepping off a cliff and trusting the air to hold. His children spoke at once, threats disguised as reason, pleading disguised as outrage, yet their voices seemed to come from far away, muffled by the pounding in his ears. He set the pen down, lifted his glass of water, and for the first time that morning his face changed. Color draining, eyes unfocusing, breath catching like something inside him had snapped. The glass tilted, water spilling across the white linen like a sudden omen, and as his hand reached for the table edge, the world swayed, while his children's shouting blurred into a single terrified word. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet urgency, the kind of clean that never feels comforting. The billionaire lay beneath bright ceiling panels that made his skin look paler than it should, monitors blinking beside him like small, indifferent witnesses. His children stood in the hallway just outside the room, voices sharp and overlapping, arguing not about fear, but about damage control. Who would talk to the press? Who would call the board? Who would secure the documents? Nurses moved past them with practiced calm, glancing once, then looking away, because they had seen 1,000 families fall apart in different costumes. The new year had arrived, and already it was asking for truth without permission. When his eyes opened again, the billionaire looked smaller, not in dignity, but in the way illness strips power down to bone. He stared at the ceiling for a moment as if searching for an exit that wasn't there, then turned his head toward the window, where winter light pressed against the glass. His voice came out rough, barely more than breath. "My lawyer," he murmured, and the lawyer stepped in quickly, face drawn tight with concern and calculation. The billionaire's gaze drifted past him to the doorway, where his children hovered like guards, protecting an inheritance. "Not them," he whispered, and the sentence carried more grief than anger. The doctor spoke in measured tones about stress, blood pressure, warning signs, phrases that sounded ordinary until they were attached to a man who had always believed he was untouchable. His daughter nodded as if she were listening, but her eyes kept darting to the briefcase, to the papers, to the places where money lived, even in a hospital. His son's jaw stayed clenched, the muscle jumping in the same place every time the word "will" came up. The billionaire watched them with a quiet sadness, and for the first time he seemed to understand the cost of raising people inside a world where love was measured by access. He swallowed, throat working hard, and then he said a name that didn't belong in that room of wealth and sterile light. Marisol Reyes. The hallway went still. His son blinked, as if he had misheard. His daughter's face tightened, and her voice sharpened with disbelief. "You want the waitress here?" she hissed, stepping closer as if proximity could correct his thinking. "This is a hospital, not a stage for your experiment." The billionaire closed his eyes for a beat, the way a man does when he is tired of explaining himself to people who never listened. "She's not part of an experiment," he rasped. "She's a witness." The word landed heavy, and the lawyer's expression shifted, realizing this request wasn't sentimental, it was deliberate. Across town, Marisol sat at Mrs. Delaney's kitchen table, phone in her hand, staring at the withheld paycheck message as if staring could change policy into mercy. The room smelled of soup and warm bread, but fear had a way of cooling everything from the inside. Mrs. Delaney poured tea and set it down without speaking, then watched Marisol's face with patient concern. When the knock came at the door, it startled Marisol so hard she nearly dropped her phone. Mrs. Delaney opened it, and a man in a dark coat stood on the porch with a posture too careful for a neighbor. "Marisol Reyes?" he asked gently. "I'm with Mr. Harlow's attorney." "There's been an emergency." Marisol's stomach dropped. The name Harlow finally had weight, finally had a shape, and she felt the night at the diner return like a wave. "I don't want anything," she said quickly, as if the world might accuse her of chasing money just because it had found her again. The man shook his head. "He asked for you," he replied. "Not for a photo, not for the press. For you." Mrs. Delaney's eyes met Marisol's, and in that look was both caution and quiet encouragement, the kind that says, sometimes doing the right thing means walking into discomfort on purpose. The drive to the hospital felt unreal, streetlights smearing into long gold lines against the windshield, the city still scattered with confetti like yesterday's hope left on the ground. Marisol's hands stayed clasped in her lap the whole way, not praying loudly, but holding herself together with stubborn breath. When she stepped into the hospital corridor, the air felt colder than the street, and the fluorescent lights flattened everything into harsh truth. She saw the billionaire's children first, perfect clothes, sharp eyes, faces that looked at her like she'd tracked mud into their world. For a moment, Marisol wanted to turn around and disappear back into the simple safety of Mrs. Delaney's kitchen. But then she heard the billionaire's voice from inside the room. Weak, strained, yet certain. "Let her in," he said, and the command carried no cruelty this time, only need. Marisol walked forward, feeling every step like a test she hadn't agreed to take, and the children parted reluctantly, as if forced by a power they couldn't argue with. When she entered, the billionaire turned his head toward her, eyes glassy but focused, and the machines beside him kept beeping with calm indifference. Marisol stood at the foot of his bed, and the room held its breath again, because everyone could feel that whatever she said next would not be about money at all, but about the kind of truth that rearranges a family. Marisol didn't rush to the bedside, and she didn't shrink either. She stood where she was, letting the hospital lights show her plainly, as if she refused to be turned into a symbol. The billionaire's children watched her like guards watching a gate, waiting for her to say something wrong so they could prove she didn't belong. The machines beside the bed kept their steady rhythm, beeping without opinion, as if they had no interest in money, legacies, or pride. Marisol felt the old instinct to apologize for existing in someone else's space, but she swallowed it down. She looked at the man in the bed, not the suit, not the empire, not the headlines, just a tired human being with fear behind his eyes. "You asked for me," she said softly, and the simplicity of the sentence made it impossible to twist into drama. The billionaire nodded once, the movement small and expensive with effort. His gaze held hers, the way it had in the diner, but now there was no game in it, only something raw and unfinished. Marisol could feel his children waiting for her to plead, to accuse, to perform, to become the story they already wanted to tell about her. She refused all of it. "I don't want your money," she added calmly, because she knew that was what they feared most, that she had come to take something. His daughter's mouth tightened as if the words offended her by existing. "Then why are you here?" she snapped, voice too sharp for a hospital, too polished to sound truly scared. Marisol turned her head slightly, meeting the woman's eyes without hostility, only clarity. "Because he asked," Marisol said, and then she looked back at the billionaire. "And because sometimes," she continued, "a person needs someone who will tell the truth when everyone else is negotiating." The lawyer shifted near the foot of the bed, suddenly attentive in a different way, as if he realized this conversation might matter more than signatures. The billionaire's son scoffed under his breath, but even his scoff sounded uncertain in the sterile quiet. Marisol stepped a little closer, not close enough to be intimate, close enough to be heard. "Last night," she said, "you weren't tipping me." Her voice stayed gentle, but the words landed with weight. "You were trying to buy a feeling, proof that goodness still exists, proof that you're not alone in a world you paid to control." Duh. The billionaire's eyes filled, and the tears made him look younger for a second, not because tears soften a man, but because they reveal what's been hidden. His breathing caught, and the monitors didn't change their rhythm, but the room did. The air shifted, as if the truth had taken up space and refused to move. His son opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out that wouldn't sound ugly. His daughter's face flickered, anger trying to hold its ground, fear trying to slip past it. The billionaire turned his head slightly, looking at his children as if seeing them for the first time without the comfort of denial. "I gave you everything," he whispered, voice breaking on the word, everything, "and I still—" He stopped, swallowing hard, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of years that had never been spoken aloud. Marisol watched him, not triumphant, not pleased, only sad for a man who had built walls high enough to keep love out. "I don't hate you," Marisol said quietly, and the sentence softened something that had been clenched in him for decades. "But I won't be your proof." She paused, letting the words settle, then added the one line that turned the room inside out. "If you want to leave something behind that matters," she said, "stop trying to be admired and start trying to be forgiven." Udi, the billionaire, closed his eyes, tears slipping into the lines of his face, and when he opened them again, there was a strange calm there, like someone who had finally admitted the truth to himself. He glanced toward the lawyer, then toward his children, and with a voice that barely rose above the beeping machines, he said, "Bring the documents, and listen this time," while his son's expression changed from outrage to fear, because he could feel his future shifting without his permission. The lawyer returned an hour later with a thicker folder and a quieter face, as if he had finally understood he was not carrying paperwork, but a turning point. The billionaire looked smaller against the hospital sheets, yet something in him had grown steadier, like a man who had stopped bargaining with himself. His children stood at the foot of the bed, polished, stiff, caught between fear and pride, watching the pen as if it were a weapon aimed at their lives. Outside the room, nurses moved past with soft footsteps, and the hospital lights kept shining without emotion, making every expression impossible to hide. The billionaire's hand trembled when he reached for the documents, not from weakness alone, but from the gravity of what he was choosing. "I built this empire to protect you," he said to his children, voice thin but clear. "And all it did was teach you to confuse comfort with love." His son's face tightened, ready to argue, ready to call it manipulation, but the words wouldn't come out clean in front of the beeping machines. His daughter's eyes flashed, then softened for a heartbeat, too brief to admit, too real to ignore. The billionaire signed anyway, slow and deliberate, each stroke like a confession written in ink. The lawyer's gaze stayed lowered, but his fingers pressed the folder edges so hard his knuckles whitened, because he knew the war this would ignite when the hospital doors closed behind them. Marisol stood near the window, silent, not because she was afraid, but because she understood some changes must happen without applause. When it was done, the billionaire exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired in a clean way, the way people look after finally telling the truth. He turned his head toward Marisol, and for the first time his eyes held something that wasn't measurement or challenge. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And the apology wasn't for the diner alone. It was for the habit of using money to avoid being human. Marisol nodded once, not granting him forgiveness like a prize, but acknowledging the courage it takes to admit fault when pride has been your lifelong shelter. The lawyer cleared his throat, then spoke quietly about next steps, trusts, clauses, protections, as if law could make softness safe. The billionaire interrupted with a small shake of his head. "No cameras," he said. "No press, no speeches, just do it right." Weeks passed, and the world outside the hospital kept spinning, indifferent to the private earthquake that had begun under fluorescent lights. The diner changed hands after a quiet legal shove, and Dean's authority vanished, the way authority often does when it meets accountability. Marisol was offered her job back with apologies that sounded rehearsed, but she didn't rush to return because she had learned something about herself that could not be unlearned. Mrs. Delaney helped her file complaints, find community resources, and keep the lights on until the paycheck issue was corrected. In a small church basement, Marisol found people who didn't ask for her story before they offered help, and she realized dignity could be protected by community, not just by stubbornness. Across town, the billionaire, still recovering, began funding quiet programs under his late wife's name: emergency rent support, scholarships for service workers, training for better jobs, all done with no banners and no bragging. The strangest change was his children. At first, they volunteered because it looked like penance and sounded like strategy, showing up stiffly at community centers with forced smiles and careful hands. But weeks of serving soup, listening to stories and meeting people who did not fear them began to dull their arrogance in small, reluctant ways. The billionaire watched it happen from a distance, saying little, letting discomfort do the work money never could. One afternoon, his daughter stayed after a shift to sweep the floor without being asked, and the act was so ordinary it almost looked holy. His son, silent at a donation drive, handed a winter coat to a shivering man and didn't look away afterward. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was the beginning of something that might grow if watered with humility. Then came the invitation Marisol did not expect. A request to meet at the lawyer's office, not at the mansion, not at a gala, not anywhere that required her to dress like she was auditioning for respect. Marisol walked into the downtown building with her shoulders back, wearing simple clothes and the calm of a woman who no longer needed to prove she deserved space. The receptionist greeted her by name without condescension, and that alone felt like a small miracle. In a quiet conference room, the lawyer placed an envelope in front of her, sealed, unmarked except for one word written neatly across the flap: Marisol. "This is from him," the lawyer said, voice careful. "He insisted you receive it privately." Marisol's fingers hesitated on the paper, not from greed, but from the fear of being turned into a symbol again. She opened it slowly, the sound of the seal breaking loud in the quiet room, and unfolded a single sheet. There was no legal language, no numbers, no conditions, just one line, written in a hand that looked shakier than the billionaire's voice had ever allowed. Marisol read it once, then again, and her breath caught as if the sentence had reached straight into the part of her that had been trying not to hope. Because it wasn't money that stared back at her from the page, it was something far more personal than any tip could ever be. Marisol sat in the quiet conference room with the envelope open in her hands, the paper trembling slightly, not because she was weak, but because she was human. The lawyer's office was too clean, too still, the kind of place where emotions usually get translated into clauses and signatures. Yet the single line on that page refused to become legal language, refused to become a transaction, refused to be reduced to a number with commas. It read, "Thank you for refusing me, because you gave me back my name before I die." Marisol read it again, slower, feeling the meaning settle into her chest like warm breath after a long winter walk. In that sentence, she heard an apology without performance, a confession without excuses, and something rare: an old man finally asking to be remembered as a person, not a headline. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she sat very still and thought of her mother's hands, the way they had worked and prayed and held the family together without anyone clapping. She thought of Nico asleep on the couch, the overdue notice, the fear that had tried to force her into silence, and the moment in the diner when she had pushed the receipt back and chosen to stay herself. The billionaire's line did not erase her struggles, but it honored the part of her that had refused to be purchased. And for the first time in a long time, Marisol felt something in her life loosen, like a knot that had been pulled tight for years finally beginning to give. The gift that followed was not delivered like a trophy, and that was the point. There was a modest trust set up for Marisol's education and for Nico's schooling, along with emergency support that would keep their lights on and their rent steady. No cameras, no speeches, no public gratitude required. Even the lawyer, a man trained to expect suspicion, spoke gently when he explained it, as if he knew the dignity of the moment mattered more than the paperwork. Marisol signed what she needed to sign, not in awe, not in submission, but with the calm of someone accepting help that came without hooks. She walked out into the winter air and realized the sky looked the same as it always had, grey, wide, indifferent, but she felt different beneath it. She wasn't saved by wealth. She was strengthened by the fact that someone finally learned to give without taking. In the months that followed, the diner's neon continued to blink through early mornings and late nights, but it no longer felt like a place where people were made small for entertainment. Marisol didn't return as a defeated employee. She returned one day as a manager in training, helping build a workplace where young servers didn't have to trade dignity for survival. Nico's grades improved when he stopped studying with fear in his chest, and one evening he hugged Marisol so hard she nearly laughed, the kind of hug that says, "I'm safe because you were brave." Across town, the billionaire spent his remaining time differently: less boardroom, more hospital visits for community programs, more quiet apologies to the people he had once treated like props. His children, slowly and awkwardly, began to learn that generosity isn't a performance, and respect isn't something you buy. It's something you practice until it becomes real. And that is how a cold, calculating man discovered what his fortune had failed to teach him. Money can change a life, yes, but only character can change a heart. A waitress didn't rewrite a will with charm or strategy. She rewrote it with one honest boundary, spoken without an audience, at the exact moment the world was counting down to a new year. In the end, what saved that empire wasn't a bigger number. It was a smaller truth. Help is only help when it leaves a person standing tall. From my heart to yours, I wish you all a happy new year, full of peace, health, and second chances. Where are you going to spend New Year's Eve this year? At home with family, at a friend's house, or somewhere special? And if you enjoy stories about kindness, courage, and redemption, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.